So what comes to mind when you think of COVID-19? I'll just give maybe like 30 seconds to a minute to just reflect. Feel free to share in the chat or annotate the slide. But again, just take really some time and reflect. And then I'll share what I think personally, and then we can open it up. Perfect. So what comes to mind for me when I think of COVID-19, honestly, is isolation. I lived alone during COVID because my roommate actually went up to visit her family and stay with them. But for me, my family was in Toronto and I was in Vancouver during the time. So I lived alone. So it was very isolating, especially with the social distancing and the staying at home. So that's how I felt during COVID. It felt really isolating. And I hope that it didn't feel the same for you. So where did COVID-19 originate? COVID-19 originated in, we like to think that it originated in Wuhan, China, or that's where the speculations of the origin were. And it was because of bats that were sold in a wet market. So wet markets are small markets. They're small marketplaces where local farmers sell fresh produce and meat, and they offer a lot of fresh and affordable food to consumers and provide jobs for farmers. But it's really important to distinguish the different types of markets that are present. So a wet market specifically they sell like consumption oriented perishable goods in a non-supermarket settings. Wildlife markets, on the other hand, sell non-domesticated wild animals, either captive bred or wild caught, and they can be dead or alive. And then the live animal markets sell live animals. And so Huanan, which is a place in China, Huanan seafood whole place market in Wuhan, China, was actually a wet market, a live animal market, and a wildlife market. So it was all of the following. So they really had everything that I just mentioned. And so wet markets have been implicated in many zoonotic outbreaks, and this includes COVID-19. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was possible that at the Huanan seafood wholesale market in Wuhan, the attention was focused on threats that wet markets were posing all these different health and biodiversity problems. Bats and pangolins are actually known to carry viruses that are related to the SARS-CoV-2, but none of them were present at these markets. There were 4 species with known susceptibility to SARS-related coronaviruses that were found in the species that were sold at these markets, and those 4 are raccoon dogs, hog badgers, masked palm civets, and mink. And so previously, hog badgers and masked palm civets were important because they were an intermediate host for this SARS-CoV emergence in China back in 2001. And so that's something that's really important to know. So as for the origins of COVID-19, there are a lot of wet markets that sell only fresh produce and dead domesticated animals. And they actually serve as the primary means of food acquisition and nutrition for a lot of people all around the world, especially in East and Southeast Asia. So because of a lot of pressures from these supermarkets, there was an increase in crowdedness, productivity, and even stressful conditions for animals in wet markets because of the really, really high demand for them. And so policymakers actually need to take some time and reflect on this, and they need to understand how to target their actions to efficiently safeguard human health and biodiversity without depriving people of access to this food, because a lot of people really do depend on this food, again, especially in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And so you can learn more about how this is done through one of our programs, which is Food and Resource Economics. It's one of our second year entry programs. And it really teaches you about the different economic impacts of different food markets and different approaches. Again, very interdisciplinary, which is incredible. Xenophobia is a dislike or prejudice against people from other countries. That's how it's defined in the dictionary. But essentially what it is a fear and dislike of customs or cultures or people that are unknown or unusual. So if we take this word and we break it down, the term xenophobia comes from Greek roots, where the word phobos, or the phobia part, means fear. I took classical studies, so I learned this in school. And then the other part is xenos, which means like a stranger or a foreigner or something that's unusual from the outside, maybe like an outsider. And so that's what the word xenophobia means. Essentially, it's like a fear of like the unknown or of an outsider. And this can actually really result in a lot of prejudice against different people due to this fear. So it can, a lot of imprecise language can foster xenophobia towards a lot of other cultures, especially with longstanding and largely dietary practices that are really unusual to people. So maybe in Canada, people are really used to eating one specific thing, and then when they see something around the world that's being congested or eaten, it's really, really unusual to them. And that's where that prejudice can come from. And so all wet markets are not a threat to human health, but people are seeing them as such due to COVID. And there has been a lot of anti-Asian sentiments that have emerged due to this. And so I just want to say that wet markets are not solely responsible for global pandemics, but they just represent one way or one vessel for zoonotic transmission potential along a global wildlife trade supply chain. Because today things are so globalized and things are moved all over the world, it's really important to note that this happens to just be one vessel. But unfortunately, there has been a lot of increased hate crimes in the media and around the world after the emergence of COVID, and this how people suspected that COVID-19 started in the wet markets of Wuhan, China. As for Canada specifically, there was a lot of, again, like there was a really strong backlash or a really strong reaction from people in Canada that was fueled by fear, because people were panic buying non-perishable items, and then a lot of the demands in restaurants plummeted. So the supply and demand kind of went all out of whack, where the supply and demand were actually not being matched, and this resulted in a lot of milk being dumped, because in the dairy industry, you have to continuously milk your cows even if people are not buying. And so because the number of buyers really decreased, a lot of dumping of milk that came from these cows had to happen. There were tens of millions of fresh food that was destroyed, millions of milk gallons per day, millions and hundreds of thousands of eggs that were smashed every single week, millions of pounds of beans and cabbage that was destroyed. And this put a huge financial strain on our farmers. There were a lot of businesses that either closed completely or even operated at a greatly reduced capacity. And they would try and provide takeout or delivery services exclusively, but this really took a big toll on their income and their ability to function normally. There was a large number of layoffs, there was a lot of debt, and there was a lot of bankruptcy. And the industry experienced constant challenges, and they needed to adapt to repeated reopenings and shutdowns because of the way that COVID was functioning in our system and in our society. And this was because also how the number of COVID-19 cases were fluctuating across the country. So there was a total of 86.5% of food services and drinking places that experienced a decrease in revenue in 2020 alone, and this increased the uncertainty of their business survival. So there was unfortunately a lot of downfalls or negative responses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, with food being unaffordable now because it's being overpriced due to the imbalanced supply and demand, as well as a lot of food going to waste, a lot of sales declined in the food services. And then of course, a lot of things moved to online, where things weren't able to function in person and remain open. Either they were tried to be as remote as possible or to completely shift to an online host. And then finally, there was, of course, increased expenditure on personal protective equipment, sanitation, and cleaning supplies. So I'd like to take this moment to highlight a faculty member because this really directly ties into our topic today. And that's Dr. Carol McCausland. And the pandemic really affected the food systems worldwide. And one way to study these was through food resource economics in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, which is the program that I talked more a little bit about earlier. And Dr. McCausland is actually an associate professor in FRE. We call it FRE for short, Food Resource and Economics. And she's the Canada Research Chair in the Trade and Environment Director, as well as for this, and this is for the Center for Food Resource and Economic and Environmental Economics, and she teaches a couple courses here at UBC. So she is an associate professor of this FRE program here at UBC, and some of the courses that she teaches are FRE 460, which is the economics of food consumption, again, directly applicable to what we're learning about today. So microeconomics of consumer decisions and public policy in food context, maybe foodborne illnesses, economic causes and consequences of obesity, syntaxes and prohibitions, and as well as information campaigns and advertising, labeling, food waste, and ethics. So very, very much applicable to today. And to just highlight some of her research, she focused on the interactions between globalization and public good provision. And so this research was included in investigations into the impact of trade liberalization on environmental politics, as well as the potential use of trade policy to really stem damages from exotic species introductions and biological invasions. So you really can see that interdisciplinary between economics, food waste, and animals. And currently, she is navigating her research around investigating how economic impacts of international trade may vary. So the last thing I want to say is we encourage you to fill out our feedback survey, which Yelena will send in the chat. Thank you for participating today.